You're sitting down at the table to run your game. You lean forward, clear your throat, and say, "All right, in the city of Blug Blug, which we're basing in medieval Europe, everyone has to join the Adventurers Guild." Immediately, the kid with the big glasses and the whiny voice speaks up. "Actually, adventure guilds aren't realistic." You ignore him and carry on. But because you're obsessive and a little bit nutty, once everyone has gone home, you open up your history books and try to find an actual adventurer's guild. I have good news and I have bad news. The bad news is the kid is right. History never had a literal adventurer's guild where guys in shiny armor sat around waiting for a board full of rat-slaying quests to appear. The good news, I can get you super close, and what's more, I can make your Adventurers Guild feel like it authentically fits your world, despite being off the beaten path of pure realism, whatever that means in a world of magic and dragons. Welcome to another episode of Worldbuilding Blueprints, Season 2, with your host, Marie Mullaney. Now, you'd think that adventurer guilds are only something you need for a tabletop game, right? And you'd be wrong. There is a massive growing genre of lit RPG, progression fantasy, and even traditional speculative fiction that requires these kinds of organizations. Or maybe you just have an adventurer-style character and want to know how a roaming, violent specialist would actually cope in a fantasy landscape. So, let's get into it. To uncover our historical blueprint, as we so often do on this podcast, we have to start with the High Middle Ages in Italy, around the 14th century. The Italian city-states were an anomaly in Europe at the time. Unlike the rest of the continent, which was running on traditional feudalism with small agrarian populations, cities like Venice, Florence, and Milan were enormous, immensely rich, and run by merchant oligarchs rather than any kind of feudal lord. Now, they had a problem within these city-states. They had gold for days, but they lacked the native peasant population permitted and willing to bear arms with which to defend their cities. So what was a poor urban oligarch to do when the bandits came for his gold? They did what oligarchs do best. They hired outsiders. They brought in professional military contractors and sealed a formal contract called a condotta. The mercenaries who signed these were known as the condottieri, in a very elegant bit of wordplay. The condotta were pretty sophisticated legal instruments. They detailed the unit size, troop composition, exact rates of pay, duration of service, and specific indemnities for lost armor and horses. So you had what amounted to small private armies roaming around the Italian peninsula, hawking their skills. Because the army was the primary capital asset of the condottieri captain, these mercenaries hated high casualty battles of annihilation. Destroying their army meant destroying their business model. So they much preferred strategic maneuvering, siegecraft, clever positioning, sometimes even playing war games to the point where they outmaneuver each other, and then the other side just gives up and says, "Yeah, okay, you beat me." They're not going to die just for some cash. But if a city-state defaulted on pay, the condottieri would routinely switch sides mid-campaign, extort their employers, or simply take over the city and declare themselves the new lords. So it was kind of a risky business, and there are some pretty large personality who formed some of these condottieri captains. Sir John Hawkwood was an English veteran of the 100 Years' War, and he took command of the infamous White Company, turning it into a disciplined striking force. Francesco Sforza, which is a surname with too many consonants, was the absolute peak of mercenary ambition. He played Milan and Venice off against each other, leveraged his army, and eventually seized control of the Duchy of Milan in 1450, founding a major ducal dynasty. Federico III de Montefeltro was the Duke of Urbino, and he integrated mercenary command with his philosophy of Renaissance humanism. He famously never broke a contract, using his vast mercenary earnings to fund courtly arts, scholarship, and architecture in his home city, probably making him one of the most popular local dukes. Then there was Sigismundi Pandolfi Malatesta, the Wolf of Rimini, which is a peak name, no notes. Unfortunately, he was the dark side of the mercenary trade. He was a brilliant commander, but so ruthless and prone to betraying employers that he finally drew the ire of the papacy, leading to his downfall. So, the condottieri were the businessmen of war, but their slow, cautious, and very expensive style of military contract work was about to run into a radical new competitor. Before we talk about the development of Central and Middle European mercenaries, give me one moment to tell you how you can get even more out of this podcast. Members of the Just in Time Worldbuilding YouTube channel get free access to the worksheets on the topics we discuss in these podcasts. From Build It in Straw to Build It in Stone, not only do you get access to the worksheets, but also monthly members' live streams and early access to all my videos. But if you don't want to commit to a monthly membership, you can also purchase some of these worksheets on my Ko-fi page. And if you're interested in the first season's worksheets, buy the book Worldbuilding Blueprints, Volume 1, which is an epic book with color layout and worksheets that will guide you from zero to hero in fantasy world building. It contains all of the exercises and knowledge from Season 1 of this podcast. Links to all that down below. And now, onward to what happened with the Swiss mercenaries. If the condottieri were Act 1, Act 2 definitely belongs to the Swiss. In the 15th century, the Swiss cantons revolutionized tactical warfare with the Gewalthofen, disciplined pike squares armed with 18-foot pikes and halberds. In the 1470s, they annihilated the heavy cavalry of Charles the Bold, who should have maybe exercised some caution and not assumed that his horses knew enough kung fu fighting to charge a pike square. These mercs from the Alps instituted a strict corporate policy: no money, no Swiss, prompt payment in gold up front or they walked, and foreign monarchs rushed to hire them despite those terms. But the Holy Roman Emperor did not feel that he should hire Swiss mercenaries. So Emperor Maximilian I, in the 1480s, decided that he needed some troops of his own, especially in the face of aggressive French expansion, and so he created the Landsknecht. They were also mercenaries of a sort, but they worked for the Holy Roman Empire. The Landsknecht operated under a strict legal charter called the Artikelsbrief, the Articles of War. When the emperor granted a charter to a colonel, an Oberst, he assembled companies of 400 to 500 men under a captain or a Hauptmann. What makes the Landsknecht fascinating for world builders is their internal structure. They flattened class lines by drawing their membership ranks from everywhere: dispossessed peasants, urban artisans, impoverished nobility, runaway serfs, whatever. It did not matter what your background was, as long as you were willing to swing a sword in the right direction. That created a very diverse bunch of soldiers who all trained and bled together on the battlefield. The Landsknecht also had internal democracy. While the upper officers, the colonel and the captains, held imperial commissions under the Artikelsbrief, The rank-and-file soldiers elected their junior officers, their corporals, and legal representatives to ensure that their rights weren't violated under these articles. In addition, they were actually exempt from sumptuary laws, which are laws restricting luxury clothing to the nobility. I made a video about that, and you can check it out in the information card. But the Landsknecht were specifically exempt from those laws, and as a result, they adopted a garish, outrageous aesthetic designed in part as psychological warfare. They had slashed fabrics with contrasting linings, puffed sleeves, broad berets with ostrich plumes, and massive padded codpieces, often used as coin purses for that maximum ball-jingling display of the male asset, one might say. So these guys wore aristocratic luxury while wielding mass-produced violence, projecting a lawless and terrifying swagger. Okay, so Landsknecht are what we're talking about with mercenaries that could be our adventurers' guild, right? Yes, it's kind of where we're going. But first, we have to talk about why none of these organizations actually became any kind of adventurers' guild. So let's talk about real-world limiting factors. Landsknecht worked for the Holy Roman Empire as warriors in war, as soldiers. Why didn't they turn into small unit adventuring guilds, hiring out their services to local lords, local villagers, or whatever else? There are three fundamental real-world barriers that stop the formation of adventuring guilds. The first is the monopoly on violence. Early modern rulers were not so happy with armed, organized mercenaries hanging around inside city walls without a war to fight. Unemployed mercenaries turned into ruthless bandit groups 9 times out of 10, and that was just the headache no one wanted. Secondly, there was the feudal jurisdiction. We've been speaking about the Holy Roman Empire, the formation of the early states, and the Italian city-states. But bear in mind that most of Europe was still a feudal state. And in a feudal jurisdiction, local lords were the legal violence monopolist. Their job was handling local threats like wolves and raiders and bandits. And they did that using their own military might alongside feudal levies, localized militia, or gamekeepers. If they couldn't at least handle those local threats, then they were essentially breaking their social contract with their people, and it was more likely that they would face a rebellion than not. And then, of course, we come to probably the biggest reason. There is an economic paradox here that we see in all D&D worlds. Small villages simply didn't have liquid coin. A local mayor could not afford to hire high-tier armed specialists to clear out rats, goblins, or wolves, or whatever else. They had to fix it themselves or petition their lord. Only in the rich urban centers did you have that kind of money. So, how do we take these limitations and our knowledge of the Landsknecht and turn it into an engine for creating an adventurer guild that fits your world? Let's talk about that next. To overcome these historical roadblocks and make an adventurer guild make actual sense in your world, you need to adjust 3 key economic and political dials. First, shift from feudalism to urban oligarchy. Don't place your adventurer guilds in backward feudal fiefdoms. Feudal lords hate armed independent commoners on their land. Instead, anchor your guilds in rich urban city-states, your Venice, your Florence, your Milan. These cities have liquid capital, but normally small native military populations. They need independent contractors for caravan security, expeditionary exploration, recovering high-value assets, and in a fantasy world, dealing with monsters. And speaking of monsters, 2. Create the specialized violence market. In a fantasy setting, threats are asymmetric. A regular feudal levy can handle a group of human bandits, but they'll be slaughtered by a manticore, an undead outbreak, or a nest of subterranean monstrosities. High-hazard specialized threats create a genuine market demand for small, highly trained, high-risk tactical bands. So, as long as you have the money to pay for these bands, you have the market opportunity in a fantasy world where you have any kind of roaming threat that normal people can't deal with. And 3. Borrow that Landsknecht identity. Give your guild a distinct social status outside of the standard feudal order. Utilize that class erasure. Make the guild accept anyone, runaway serfs, disgraced nobles, rogue mages. Inside the guild hall, you have one corporate charter, and that is the only law that matters. All are welcome, as long as they are willing to engage in the high-risk activities of the guild. And alongside that class erasure, use flamboyancy to make your guild distinctive. Give them visual markers like the Landsknecht exemption from sumptuary laws. Adventurers should look wildly out of place compared to common peasants or traditional knights. Have them wear bizarre monster hide armor, bright colors, and ostentatious trophies to project an aura of dangerous, unpredictable capability. That kid with the big glasses was right about history. No medieval king would ever tolerate a guild full of armed freelance murder hobos hanging out in his tavern, waiting for quests to hit the board. But you aren't building a medieval kingdom. By combining the commercial contracts of the Italian condottieri, the urban wealth of the merchant oligarchs, and the democratic class-subverting swagger of the Landsknecht, you can create an organization that isn't just a video game trope. It's a living, breathing, plausible guild that can fit into any fantasy world. And that brings us to the end of our exploration of organizations in a fantasy city. Make sure to hit subscribe if you want to be notified about next month's podcast, which is when we start wrapping this season up by speaking about your final fantasy city checklist. Hit the thumbs up button and all those good things, and if you want to financially support the podcast, consider becoming a member of the Just in Time World Building channel. I very much appreciate all of the members who keep my cats fed, and all their names are currently scrolling past on the screen. And with that, I will see you soon for another episode of World Building Blueprints, where we build what we need when we need it.